A warm welcome to First Move. I'm Julia Chatterley in New York. It is great to be with you. And the European Central Bank will finally hike interest rates in an attempt to rein in soaring inflation, but not until July. The ECB plans to raise rates by 25 basis points at next month's meeting, so that's a quarter of a percentage point. It also announced significant cuts to its growth forecast stemming from the war in Ukraine. Anna Stewart has all the details. Anna, great to be with you. Let's try and avoid basis points to avoid people's eyes glazing over when they listen to us. Nice start there. Investors were pricing 0.75% percentage point rate hikes by September. Was that confirmed? Because that's a lot of hikes over a short space of time.
You know what? It's possible it wasn't confirmed. Essentially, what we're seeing here is almost a promise that there will be a rate hike of a quarter of a percentage point, see avoiding basis points there for you, Julia, in July. And then potentially for September, we could see something bigger. And this is very much what analysts and investors were looking for. What's the pace and how big? And I thought the comment from the press release actually was really interesting. It says, if the medium-term inflation outlook persists or deteriorates, a larger increment will be appropriate at the September meeting. I think that's almost the furthest sort of forward guidance I think we've ever had from the ECB. And actually going into this meeting, wasn't it interesting? We had such a hawkish tone from Christine Lagarde between the two meetings, whether it was in interviews or in blogs. So coming into this, I think people were expecting a much more hawkish move, and possibly this didn't deliver as hawkish a move as some were expecting.
If the war were to escalate, economic
sentiment
could worsen, supply-side constraints could increase, and energy and food costs could remain persistently higher than expected.
Well, Julia, we went a little early to that soundbite there, but you can hear the issue at the heart of this, which is Christine Lagarde essentially saying so much rests on the war in Ukraine, and that is why the outlook is uncertain, and they're not going to promise anything really until they see more data coming out in the months ahead. Julia?
Yeah, it's so important, to your point, the challenges of forecasting in this kind of environment, whether it's the kind of growth slowdown that we're seeing, the inflationary price pressures across the board, also how the market reacts to this, because of course they've been trying to keep interest rates, bond yields down, which obviously impacts everything that credit cards, mortgage rates are priced on around Europe. If those spike significantly higher, then a lot of the work, the tightening work's being done for them. And what are they forecasting? Can you give us any kind of sense?
Well, we've certainly seen some big moves in terms of European bond yields just today. Going into the meeting, I spoke to Deutsche Bank, the chief economist there, saying that they feel like the ECB has essentially underestimated inflation and was continuing to do so going into this. So it's really interesting to see what their inflation forecasts are. Of course, inflation hit over 8% in May, which is an all-time record, I think, or at least for many years. Now, the new staff projections are for annual inflation at 6.8% this year, so we're off the high that we've already seen, potentially declining to 3.5% next year, 2.1% in 2024. So just above their sort of baseline, if you like, in 2024. GDP also really interesting. So some significant downgrades in terms of their projections for GDP for 2022. 2.8%, for 2023, 2.1%, and they have also revised up for 2024. What I find most interesting about this is that actually being still, despite a significant downgrade in terms of this year and next year, they're still being really optimistic compared to the likes of the OECD. Julia?
Good spot. Anna Stewart, thank you so much for the context there and managing over a few technical glitches, professional and otherwise. Thank you. To Ukraine now, President Zelensky warns the fate of the entire Donbas region is being decided in Severodonetsk.
We defend our positions, inflict significant losses on the enemy. This is a very fierce battle, very difficult, probably one of the most difficult throughout this war. I'm grateful to everyone who defends this direction.
This as local officials say Russia now controls most, quote, of the city. Sama Abdelaziz joins us now. Some poignant words, I think, there once again from President Zelensky, and underscores the point of the weaponry, the longer range weaponry that they've been asking for now for many weeks and months. Sama, how bad is the situation?
If you're reading the situation on the ground and you hear what President Zelensky is saying, which is that the fate of Donbass lies in Severodonetsk, then the fate of Donbass simply does not look promising for Ukraine. We know, according to local Ukrainian officials, that Ukrainian troops have pulled back, withdrawn strategically to fortified positions. They are outmanned, they are outgunned. They say that they have a catastrophic shortage of artillery barrages. They have been for weeks now, been pounded by a superior Russian artillery. Look, it's hard to read what Ukrainian officials are saying and not assume that it is almost inevitable that Severodonetsk falls. And this is important, Julia. I want to just pull up that map of the front lines. You can take a look at why this one city matters, why these grueling battles are taking place. And that's because it's one of the last strongholds in the Luhansk region. If Severodonetsk falls, essentially Luhansk falls to Russian troops, and the Donbass region then becomes one step closer to being fully under Russian control. And last night, there seems to have been an uptick in the Russian offensive on this area. Ukrainian officials are predicting that Russian troops want to have a win by this weekend, because Sunday is Russia Day. That's a national holiday, their Independence Day. President Putin might want to make a point of taking Severodonetsk by that point.
Sam, and it matters for many other reasons too. If we can pull that map up again, it ties to the port access, the water access that's so critical for this part of the Ukraine country in particular. And again, a warning from the UN Secretary General echoing what the World Food Programme is saying now, that the risk that millions more people are pushed to near starvation as a result of being unable to get the significant amounts of grain out of Ukraine that the rest of the world needs.
Absolutely, Julia. And this is the fear. This is the domino effect. This is the possibility that the United Nations, that the Western world is warning of, that hundreds of millions of people could be left starving, could be left destitute, that this could trigger larger conflicts across the Middle East and Africa if there is food insecurity. Right now, there is 20 million tons of grain trapped inside Ukraine. Ukrainian officials cannot export it. I'm going to pull up that map again. I'm sorry, but it is the easiest way to explain this. If you look at that coastline along the Black Sea, along the Sea of Azov, that's what Russian forces have been taking in this more than 100-day conflict. They have been taking control of those areas. You still have Odessa, of course, which is under full Ukrainian control, but Moscow is not allowing ships with grain on them to leave the port of Odessa to go and export that grain. There was talks in Ankara yesterday between Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, of course, of Russia, and his counterparts. No solution has been found. This is a difficult diplomatic effort here, because Ukraine says that Russia is essentially holding this grain hostage, that it is using food as a weapon. The EU chief agrees. She says it's part of the arsenal of terror for Russia to hold on to this grain, to not allow these supplies to pass through these ports. There's been various solutions put into place from third countries, trying to guarantee the security of Ukrainian ships. No agreement on that. And these are the 20 million tons of grains right now that are trapped. This is the beginning of the season. There is more and more. There is an expiration date on this, of course. This is highly concerning for the diplomatic world. This is highly concerning for the Middle East and Africa that rely on the breadbasket here in Ukraine, and there's no solution in sight, Julia.
No, and we're going to speak to the Deputy Minister of Agricultural Policy for Ukraine later on in the show, so hopefully get some context on what may or may not be able to be done. Salma, great to have you with us. Thank you. OK, let me bring you up to speed with some of the other stories making headlines around the world. The special US House committee investigating the January 6th storming of the US Capitol will begin to lay out its case on primetime TV later today. The panel aims to connect the dots between former US President Donald Trump's attempt to overturn the 2020 election and the violence at the Capitol building. And also on Capitol Hill, the Democratic majority in the US House of Representatives voted for a sweeping gun control package on Wednesday.
On this vote, the yeas are 223, the nays are 204. The bill is passed.
The measure, though, not expected to pass the Senate due to opposition by Republicans. Meanwhile, on a late-night TV show, President Joe Biden answered questions about what he alone can do on gun reform.
Can't you issue an executive order? Trump passed those out like Halloween candy.
Yes, sir.
I did. Isn't that something that could happen?
Well, I have issued executive orders within the power of the presidency to be able to deal with these, everything having to do with guns, gun ownership, whether or not you have to have a waiting, all the things that are within my power. But what I don't want to do, and I'm not being facetious, I don't want to emulate Trump's abuse of the Constitution and constitutional authority.
Immigration along the southern U.S. border will top the agenda at the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles. President Biden launched the event on Wednesday. Mexico and 3 Central American countries are boycotting the summit because Venezuela, Nicaragua and Cuba were not invited by the United States, citing their human rights records. And getting into the swing of things, golfers like Phil Mickelson and Dustin Johnson began teeing off at the first ever live golf event outside London. The winner of the controversial Saudi-backed series will take home a whopping $4 million prize. And Alex Thomas is at the Centurion Club looking at all the action. Alex, I was going to ask you about the weather first and foremost, but I can see it looks pretty grey behind you. You can always count on England to have shocking weather on this kind of occasion. What's it like there? What's the atmosphere and who's there? Give us a sense.
Yeah, a sunny, hot British summer is still the one thing that Saudi Arabian dollars cannot buy, Julia, that's for sure. But there is a bit of a buzz here on the opening day, certainly much more than yesterday's final practice day. I would say the crowd measures in its hundreds, not thousands so far, but perhaps not surprising for still a new venture that nonetheless has created a huge shockwave through global sport and geopolitics and where they collide. It's probably looking a bit empty behind me now because that was the driving range full of players and they've now all been ferried off in London black cabs to 16 of the 18 holes being played here because it's a shotgun start, one of the new innovations that Live Golf say is going to shake up the established order, which means that the groups of 3 will be on 16 of the 18 holes. A loud horn will sound in around, well, 4 minutes now, and that's the signal for all the groups to start at the same time. It means they'll all go around the holes in a sort of 4 or 5 hour period, having the same conditions at the same time, removing that lottery of whether you tee off in the morning very early or in the afternoon very late, which has decided some tournaments in the past. As I speak, we're going to have a flyover of planes. Oh, they look like old Spitfires to me. You can probably hear them rather than see them. I'm not going to ask the camera to suddenly flick up into the sky at the last minute. So they're trying to put on a bit of a show. There's a great fans village here, lots of interaction here, a kind of Coldstream Guards band playing as well, trying to play on the kind of London theme, although most of the other tournaments will be held in the USA. There's one in Thailand, one in Saudi Arabia as well. But we're waiting to see what reaction there'll be from the Live Golf Series main rival, the PGA Tour, which has not allowed its players to play here. They're playing here against the permissions of the tour of which they were members. Some have resigned that membership. Of course, the PGA Tour can't take any action, Julia, until a ball is hit competitively. So that statement, there could be someone literally sitting in PGA Tour headquarters with their finger over the send button as we speak.
Fascinating. So we'll wait and see what the PGA do, if anything, over the coming minutes and an hour, I suppose. And just what you want, that kind of flyover as you're on the putting green there or trying to tee off. That was really loud. Yes, Alex, great to have you. Thank you. Alex Thomas there. OK, straight ahead on First Move, as Russia is accused of weaponizing food, the Ukrainian Deputy Agriculture Minister tells us it's a global problem. Plus, highly charged, the Swedish startup trying to jumpstart Europe's EV industry. All coming up. Stay with us. And welcome back to First Move. US stock futures turning lower over the past hour, reflecting a more negative tone across Europe. Bond yields also moving higher, as Anna mentioned earlier. But that's a worldwide story. It comes after the European Central Bank signalled it's finally ready to raise interest rates. Policymakers are set to begin hiking borrowing costs next month and ending their quantitative easing programme within weeks. That's their bond buying programme, the first real steps towards taming rampant inflation. The task before global central bank is becoming all the more urgent as oil prices spike to 11-year highs. Both Brent and US crude currently trading over $120 a barrel. The oil minister for the UAE warning yesterday that oil prices are nowhere near their peak. That disconcerting projection reflected in the share price of oil giants like Exxon, closing at a record high on Wednesday. Exxon trading above $100 a share for the first time in 8 years. And it's not just the soaring cost of fuel that's jolting economies. Higher food prices are impacting family budgets globally too, as the cost of basic staples skyrockets due in part to the war in Ukraine. Corn and wheat are up more than 60% this year, while soybeans and sunflower oil up more than 35%. Wheat prices also up more than 50%, and the OECD warning yesterday of the risks of food shortages in emerging markets due to the Ukraine conflict. Adding to that risk, Russia has been accused of stealing hundreds of tons of Ukrainian grain and turning food into a weapon of war.
And this is a cold, callous and calculated siege by Putin on some of the most vulnerable countries and people in the world. And therefore, honourable members, food has become now part of the Kremlin's arsenal of terror.
United Nations Secretary General said the war threatens to, quote, unleash an unprecedented wave of hunger and destitution around the world. The UN now warns the conflict could push 47 million people into acute food insecurity. The World Food Programme has been saying that for a while now. Let's talk about this. Joining us now is Taras Vysotsky. He's the first Deputy Minister of Agrarian Policy and Food in Ukraine. Deputy Minister, great to have you with us. I want to talk to you about theft. To begin, can you quantify for me how much grain you believe the Russians have stolen and what evidence you have for this?
Hello, thank you for the invitation and for the call. Unfortunately, we have the situation where about 500,000 tons of grain has been stolen by Russians on the partly occupied territories of Ukraine. We do know this because we have received the information from the people on the elevators that Russians came, just took this grain, came with military power. And also we have the video and photo effects of cars and rail cars bringing this grain towards the direction of Russia or occupied Crimea. And even after that, we have the satellite images that the ships were loaded with the grain in Crimea, where there has been no harvest of grain from the previous year left, and then moved to other countries. That's why from these resources we understand about these travels.
What about strategic reserves? How much of this is your strategic reserves of grain, and are they somewhere else and protected, or are they also at risk given their location?
Fortunately, there has been no strategic reserves left on this partly occupied territory. So in overall, we have now around 22 million tons of grains on the controlled territory of Ukraine. So comparing with the strategic reserves, these volumes are not important and not big.
What about the current harvest as that's farmed? How do you protect that from theft?
So first of all, on the controlled area, farmers have finished planting and preparing to start harvesting in a month. And if we talk about the partly occupied territory, these territories, most of the spring planting wasn't done. So first of all, we are waiting for the militaries to free these territories and then move on. And on the controlled territory, of course, it is protected and we will be able to keep harvesting the necessary crops.
I mean, this is a global issue, and we've talked about this. What you were just saying there is also very important, and the inability to be able to plant for next season. Deputy Minister, how much of a reduction are you expecting in the next harvest as a result of the war and the challenges of planting and the loss of farmers, people being able to do so? Is it going to be half? Is it going to be less than that? Can you give us any sense?
Actually, we have lost 25% of the arable area, but in terms of volumes, of course, it is more. We anticipate that the harvest will be around 35% less than previous years, which means around 30 million tons less. So 35–40% less, almost half of the previous year harvest.
Wow, I mean, it's incredible that you've managed to achieve what you have with planting this year. I want to talk about immediate priorities, and that is trying to get grain out and port access to allow grain to flow to the rest of the world. There was obviously the meeting in Ankara yesterday between the foreign ministers of Turkey and of Russia, and Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said effectively that the ball is in Ukraine's court and you need to remove the mines that are in the water. Can Ukraine do that? Are you willing to do that? And how long would it take?
It's untrue. So the problem is in Russian military ships. So it's not the case of Ukraine. So far, they don't allow safely really to keep the civilian ships move in and out of Ukrainian ports. And until the real guarantees or safety guarantees are received by Ukraine on behalf of international partners that it is possible, we can't talk about letting these ships in or out. So that's the main problems, that Russians keep with military ships near the Ukrainian sea border and don't allow safely. No one provides necessary guarantees, safety guarantees that the crews of these ships, the goods on these ships and the ships itself could be safely brought in and out of our Ukrainian ports. So far, we haven't received it.
I understand. And it's the same for commercial ships. No one's going to get any insurance to be able to go in there until there's guarantees of peace and safety. But I want to ask you again about the mines. Deputy Minister, can you clear those mines and how long would it take?
Well, so it depends again. So what is the goal? If we receive the victory and the war is ended, of course, we can clear it quite quickly. If it's still some corridors within the war, it's another story. So to make the processes physically, it's not very complicated. First of all, it depends on the other obstacles, including the war is going on or not.
But you're making the point, which I think is an accurate one, that peace and some form of ceasefire has to be established in this region before you'll consider removing those mines to allow any ships to flow. I want to ask you a final point on this, that the head of the World Food Programme told me recently that the world needs Russia's grain and it needs Russia's fertilizer. So there should be carve-outs, exceptions for companies and those people that are trading with Russia in order to ensure food security around the world. Do you agree with that? I know it's a difficult question. It's an ethical question as much as anything else.
Our position is quite clear. Ukraine is ready to fulfill all the obligations in order to supply necessary food for international food security, without any limits. So the point is very clear. Russia should stop the war. We can't have other discussions. If we stop it today, all of these goods can move on tomorrow. No problem at all. They're ready. We are not going to save them or stock them inside of the country. We are ready to support. So let's focus on finishing the war and not finding different other suggestions which can't guarantee safe results.
Deputy Minister, thank you for your time. We appreciate the information, so thank you. The Deputy Minister of Agrarian Policy and Food of Ukraine. We're back after this with the Market Open. Stay with us. Welcome back to First Move, and it's a muted start to the stock market trading day as the ECB gets set to raise rates for the first time in over a decade. The European Central Bank announcing that it's set for rate hike liftoff next month, playing a bit of catch-up, I think, with central banks in the rest of the world who are already tightening borrowing costs. Christine Lagarde and company not signalling a hawkish half-a-point hike in July as some as expected, but a more aggressive action could come later this year. The European Central Bank also cutting its growth forecast sharply and raising inflation expectations to almost 7% this year. All this as the US gets set to release its latest read on consumer price inflation in Friday's session. And a mostly lower day over in Asia too. Beijing helping set the tone after announcing that it will begin closing up bars and cafes and sports facilities yet again as new COVID cases rise. The Nikkei, however, jumped 1%. It's now down a mere 2% for the year so far. Wow, that is a global outperformer. Now, The war in Ukraine, China's COVID lockdowns, the climate crisis, not to mention the impact of disruptive technologies, all key global challenges that policymakers will be dealing with for years, if not decades. Ian Bremmer, the president and founder of the Eurasia Group, sees reason for hope as politicians, business leaders and citizens groups begin confronting emergencies head-on and offering solutions. He outlines the way forward in his new book, The Power of Crisis, how 3 threats and our response will change the world. Ian, always great to have you on. Actually, before I even got to the book and before we talk about it, the opening page says, to a glass half full, that first half was tasty. There is a more optimistic tone in this book, I think, compared to others that I've read from you. And that is important.
Well, that first half is tasty is a recognition that we're the ones that actually drank the first half. And I think that there's a little bit of that in the book as well.
You know, I think, and it's a great read as well, and I say that to people to take a look. I think for me, the war in Ukraine has crystallized a lot, and this comes out in the book, whether it's the new technologies that we're seeing in cyber warfare, the role of energy security, our response to that directly related to climate, of course, and then the other one in there is sort of the health crisis and the risk that we face something worse than COVID in the future. Is the one benefit of everything we've been through that leaders have lost some of their complacency?
I think that's right. And also that who we're willing to listen to as a leader has become broader. I mean, we all clearly owe a debt of gratitude to the Ukrainian president and the people of Ukraine for reminding us in the United States and in the West what we stand for, reminding us our values, knocking us out of that complacency. For decades, we've watched NATO adrift and increasingly obsolete, as Trump called it, or brain dead, as Macron did. And the Ukrainian government has forced us to start paying attention, and we're strengthening it, we're expanding it, and we're standing up for something. And what this book talks about, not just the response to the Russian invasion in Ukraine, but also all of these other crises, which is a very target-rich environment in the world these days, that increasingly does knock us out of complacency. And some of those lessons we've been willing to start learning, like on global climate change, and some of them we haven't done such a great job, like in the response to the pandemic. But nonetheless, it's very clear that the seeds of a new and more functional global order are being planted, are being sown in these crises.
The question is whether we can work well enough together to tackle some of these issues. And the book grabs you from the get-go because it talks about a conversation between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, talking about Reagan asking him if America was attacked by aliens, would Russia come and help? And the two agreed that they would work together. And Reagan, years later, was laughed about this for a number of different reasons. But the point there is a valid one, that if the threat is common and it's bigger than local, regional, even big political issues, it can be overcome together. That sort of
so I'll give you an example.
Some of these,
I mean, certainly when I was a grad student, that conversation between the Americans and the Soviets and whether we could prevent each other from blowing ourselves up with nuclear weapons, we didn't trust each other. Reagan called the Soviets the evil empire. But we recognized we need to work with each other to contain the proliferation of these incredibly dangerous weapons. Well, in the 21st century, we have lethal autonomous drones, we have offensive cyber weapons, we have artificial intelligence algorithms that make it impossible to differentiate between a real person and a fake person. And the Americans and Chinese, who dominate these technologies, haven't even started a conversation yet about how to contain their proliferation. It's very clear that if we could do that with the Soviets, we can do that with the Chinese, but we're going to have to start now.
How do you formalize it, though, Ian? You know, this goes back to a conversation you and I were having with the Microsoft president, Brad Smith, and his idea of this and concept of having a digital Geneva Convention where you bring all these big players together to tackle things like cybersecurity, for example, particularly where national security interests are concerned. How do you do that in this kind of environment where, you know, you've got North Korea off on one end, you've got China and the United States at odds economically, politically? How do you formalize this in order to get the action and the response that you're talking about?
So I'm an analyst both by temperament and by training. And so what I'm going to say may sound banal, but I think it's really true. You start by defining the problem collectively. We've done that with climate change. The entire world now agrees that there is 1.2 degrees centigrade of warming. We all know it's man-made. It's not coming from nature. There's no more fake news on this issue. Doesn't mean we're all working equally hard to resolve it, but 195 countries get together every year and actually say, this is the state of climate change. And so when the Americans and the Chinese, even though we don't work together on climate, the Chinese start investing in solar and nuclear and wind and electric vehicles, we look at them and we say, my God, they're going to be the dominant energy superpower unless we start investing. And so that competition becomes virtuous as opposed to vicious. We need to do the same thing to start on disruptive technologies, that you would need a group, could be under the UN, so like an intergovernmental panel on artificial intelligence that would have technologists and coders and members of the private sector and bureaucrats that would define the problem. What are the technologies that are truly dangerous and disruptive, where we don't have effective defense, where we need to actually contain them from proliferating? What's the nature of the club that's able to have them, and who are we prepared to actually put sanctions on if they don't? You start there. And then after you've collectively defined the problem, which I think can be done in the course of a couple of years, you start putting the people, the institutions on different aspects of that problem and start fighting it in the same way that on climate change, we have a group for biodiversity, we have another for methane, we have a third for deforestation, we have a fourth for carbon, we have a fifth for new technologies. This takes time, but it's actually a fairly clear and straightforward path on how you get there, and it doesn't require global trust of each other. It just requires an understanding of the problem.
Yeah, this is such a great point as well. We can throw in social media, perhaps, and misinformation there, another huge thing, because that's at the core of the book as well, which is not just that two superpowers like China and the United States have to come together and work on this, but you specifically point to sort of individuals and citizens in America specifically, but we can use other examples that they have to come together as well and not be so polarized.
And that's one of the most hopeful parts of the book, is that these solutions don't require Xi Jinping and Biden to sit in a room and hammer it out. The fact is that you have a multiplicity of actors that are capable of wielding power to respond. The Europeans end up playing a big role, for example, in response to COVID and in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in response to climate. That ends up being much more interesting as part of the solution. You see this with banks, with corporations, with tech companies, with mayors and governors in the United States. When Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord, it didn't really matter to the long-term trajectory of the United States in reducing carbon because so many other actors were committed to it. So, I mean, for those that look at Washington and say, my God, it's just so dysfunctional in the Beltway right now, my response is, I agree, and we're probably not going to fix that in the next 5 to 10 years, but we can work around it.
Yeah, society has to get on with it anyway. I wish we could apply some of your optimisms to my previous discussion, which is trying to find a way to get grain and address the food crisis that's going on around the world from Ukraine. Where do you think things stand, where the war is concerned and Russia's position?
You know, it didn't feature in a big way in my book in the same way that the gun crisis in the U.S. didn't feature in the same way in my book, because climate change, we didn't do much on climate change until it started affecting us, until it was about Florida and California and Italy. And I mean, every citizen in the world seeing that it's a crisis for them in their backyards. The food crisis is kind of where the climate crisis was 20, 30 years ago. It's largely going to be a crisis for the poorest and most disenfranchised around the world. And so there's a lot of great words, a lot of performative political response, but not a lot of money behind it. And that's kind of the way we've been responding to the gun crisis in the United States or the crack cocaine crisis in the 80s and 90s. A whole bunch of headlines, not a lot of there in terms of, it's not enough of a kick in the ass to force, people with power to actually change their application of resources, to start making decisions different, where a number of the global crises that I write about in the book are actually big enough to force us to act.
I didn't intend to go here, but you did, so I'm going to go there. Do you think anything changes in the United States over some form of gun control? Clearly, it's a top debate right now in Congress, but the fear is that we go no further once again.
I think it is more possible today that you have some form of incremental improvement in regulation assault weapons not being available to people under 21 as opposed to 18, maybe some more red flag laws. But these are tiny incremental changes. If you ask me, do I believe that are the Americans prepared to come together politically and legislate a response to gun control that would bring the United States in line with every other advanced industrial economy in the world? The answer to that is a very clear no.
Unfortunately and heartbreakingly, that's a perfect illustration, I think, of the conversation that we were just having. Yes. How many times did you have to edit this book, by the way, given the timing and what's in it and what's going on in the world?
It wasn't that. I started the book when the pandemic already hit, so I sort of knew the contours. The issue was that the book had to go to bed on February 26th. So on the 24th, when the invasion of Ukraine started, I had to talk to my office and say, literally every meeting that can be taken off my calendar for the next 48 hours, I'm just going to be working on writing this. And that's what I did. And thank God. Look, it could have been the February 23rd. It could have been worse.
Always great to chat to you. It's a great read. Thank you. Ian Bradley, the president and founder of Eurasia Group. Okay, coming up, how Europe's homegrown EV battery maker is gearing up to challenge big Asian players. That's next. Welcome back to First Move and to a supercharged global battery battle. I can't believe I said that right. Swedish battery maker Northvolt has recently become the first European company to ship EV batteries. It's secured more than $50 billion worth of contracts from big automakers, including BMW, Volkswagen and Volvo. Northvolt says its mission is to not just build better batteries, but greener batteries too. Let's discuss. Joining us now, the CEO of Northvolt, Peter Carlson. He's also Tesla's former Vice President of Supply Chain. Peter, great to have you on the show. Explain what this moment means and what it means too for Europe's electric vehicle ambitions.
Well, it's great to be with you. It's a big moment for us, of course. We've been, we were going live 5 years ago and have been building this factory that is now shipping towards the big electric aviation makers from northern Sweden, and it's been a tough project to run. To build a gigafactory during COVID, during the global semiconductor crisis, during logistics, but now we are here and we're starting it up and we're starting shipments. It's in small scale yet, but we're scaling up big, and we're really great to be here where we are.
Some images now, and I think with your Tesla experience, but also from what we discuss on a regular basis with the challenges of building, never mind in a pandemic, Peter, it's a cash burn business. Do you have enough money, given the promises of contracts that we mentioned in the introduction? Are you in a position now where you can ramp up?
Absolutely. I mean, we've had very strong backing by both financial investors like Goldman Sachs, pension funds, etc., but also industrial players like Volkswagen. So we are well positioned with good liquidity, and we can for sure ramp up this as we plan.
About battery manufacturing, though, for you, this is also about not swapping one vulnerability, which is our reliance on fossil fuels, for another, which you can argue would be demand for the minerals and the metals that go into these batteries. So a huge part of the premise, I think, of your business too is this promise to have, I believe, at least 50% of the materials recycled by 2030. It's this circular story of battery creation in EVs, which is the only way that we're going to allow all the automakers that are making promises of EVs achieve that over the coming years.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, the demands on critical raw materials such as nickel, lithium, cobalt, etc., is going to be growing enormously, and part of building really a sustainable business is to make recycling, and here we're using a hydrometallurgical process to separate old batteries and really being able to make new batteries out of the old materials, and this is a very important part of our circular strategy, and we will be coming online with what we think is the largest recycling refinery in Europe here during mid next year, in conjunction with the current factory.
I'm very excited about that. What's that going to mean for cost? Because it's such a huge chunk of the cost of the vehicle now. If we can incorporate recycling as we push forward, what's it going to mean in terms of the cost of the battery, along with new technology?
Well, for sure, there's going to be a startup phase where the recycling, logistics flows and processes needs to be optimized. So there is going to be a startup phase where recycling is going to be a little bit more expensive, but very soon, I think at scale, there will be a significant benefit of recycling battery materials, and that should be, of course, shared by all players, and the similar way that you see in the aluminum industry and others.
I want to ask you about hiring as well, because clearly this is a huge growth industry and it's an exciting industry, and it's technologically advanced too. Peter, do you have any trouble hiring? And I just wanted to get your sense, particularly from having been a former Tesla employee, of Elon Musk's suggestion that everyone has to be back at work. There is no working from home. How is that going to impact your recruitment drive if you tried to do the same for Northvolt? And would you?
Well, so overall in recruitment, we were able last year to recruit roughly 1,800 people, but we had over 100,000 applicants to the company, and I think, yeah, and I think it's driven out of two things. One is we have a very clear purpose to develop and do a major impact and build the world's greenest batteries. And secondly, we're also been offering pretty much every employee to also become shareholder in the company. And I think the combination of this have made a large interest to join the company. But there is a scarce of competence in this industry. It's growing incredibly fast, so it's going to continue being a war on talent here for quite some time.
Yes or no? Can they work from home?
They can work, yeah.
Okay.
They can work from home, but but we'd like to see them in the office. But
But you're not making a firm line, just checking, just if there's a bit of competition there. Peter, come back and talk to us soon. I have loads more questions, but as always, I've taken too much time. Great to chat to you, sir. Thank you. Peter Carlson, CEO of Northvolt. All right, coming up, butting heads over bots. A data deluge reports that Twitter will give Elon Musk all the data he could ever want and a whole lot he didn't. Find out why next. Welcome back to First Move. Elon Musk's data deadlock with Twitter may soon be over. The platform is planning to comply with Musk's demands for more data to help him assess the number of fake accounts or bots. That's according to the Washington Post. Paula Monica is with us now. Paul, I'm going to be a 5-year-old on a long journey and say, are we there yet? I mean, we can talk about this data and too much data and whatever it happens and how you define what a bot is, quite frankly. Is this an excuse or is the deal going to get done?
I still honestly don't know, to tell you the truth. I think that you are correct to point out that this might be yet another potential reason for Musk to try and walk away, even though that would open up the possibility of litigation. I think Twitter really wants to hold Elon Musk's feet to the fire. He says he wants to buy them for $54.20 a share, and Twitter really needs that to happen because at last check, Twitter stock is around 40. I think it makes sense that Musk is, growing a little bit more reluctant the more that he looks at Twitter. But it all again begs the question, why did he impulsively decide to do this deal without any real due diligence in the first place? This due diligence after the fact seems a little curious at best. But I do think that there are legitimate questions, Julia, about how much spam and fake accounts and bots are on the platform. Twitter says that, they let advertisers can see some of this data if they pay for it, and they claim it's only less than 5%, but there's a lot of skepticism. Some people think that it's 10 to 15% perhaps.
Yeah, and in his defense, you can't get access to that kind of data on the due diligence before you make an offer, so there has to be some information sharing, but it does feel sort of very hostile. So I think the right questions are being asked. I just wonder whether perhaps it's a way to negotiate a lower price, or to your point, perhaps not doing the deal at all. Yes, early enthusiasm, perhaps later
Fading
a bit
away.
of regret. Yeah, Paula Monica, thank you. Okay, that's it for the show. If you've missed any of our interviews today, they will be on my Twitter and Instagram pages. You can search for @JChatterleyCNN. Connect the World with Becky Anderson is up next.
very close to the front lines in southern Ukraine, where we're being shown these US-provided long-range artillery systems.
Tonight, a look at the new US weapons being sent to Ukraine, plus
spaghetti with tomato. But the price of this Italian staple has increased tremendously over the last year.
how Russia's invasion of Ukraine is increasing the price of food around the world. And
from the beginning, the investigation has focused on the unprecedented efforts by Trump and his allies to try to stop the transfer of power to President Joe Biden.
It's the January the 6th hearings kick off with a primetime showing. I'm Becky Anderson. Hello and welcome to Connect the World out of London today, where it is 3 p.m. More on those top stories in just a moment. First, a developing story with huge international significance. Iran is turning off more than 24 cameras that give international monitors access to its nuclear program. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency says this could deal a, quote, fatal blow to the Iran nuclear agreement. Well, Tehran released this video showing monitoring cameras being turned off at nuclear sites. IEA chief Rafael Grossi says Iran is planning to remove 27 of these cameras. And Iran says it's already started expanding its underground uranium enrichment. Rafael Grossi joining me now live from Vienna. It's good to have you on what is a worrying day. Does today's announcement by Iran effectively put an end to the additional monitoring measures that Iran agreed as part of the 2015 nuclear agreement deal?
Hello, good to talk to you again. No in and by itself, but very close to that.
Well, earlier today you said that if the JCPOA is not revived in the next 3 or 4 weeks, you'll no longer be able to give the world accurate details on Iran's advancements. So just explain where you believe we are at. You've suggested 3 or 4 weeks is all that is left before that agreement is dealt a fatal blow. What's going on? What is Iran planning at this point?
The reason for this is very simple. We have a number of means to verify Iran's activities in a number of areas related to the JCPOA. Cameras, as you were mentioning. We have other online systems that give us flows, give us monitoring of amounts that are being, of uranium, for example, that are being enriched, etc., etc., etc. So when Iran starts curtailing these accesses at some point, if the JCPOA was to be revived, for that to happen, the participants need to have a baseline, the necessary amounts to know what is it that Iran has or hasn't in order for us to verify. When you don't have that, it's technically impossible to have an agreement. Or you can have one on the basis of no information, which I suppose is not going to happen. This is why we're saying this is a very serious thing. It has consequences. Of course it does.
This is, you say, a serious escalation. Let's be quite clear, if your agency cannot ensure continuity of knowledge about Iran's nuclear program, you can't implement the JCPOA's monitoring and verification process, can you? So that is the end of that.
We would not be able to do it on the basis of sound information, and I don't think you can have a good agreement on shaky basis. So that is not viable. But we hope there can be a possibility to do it. I've said today to the board of governors of the IAEA, which is in session right now. In fact, I stepped out to talk to you. We are discussing this, and I've said we have to sit down with Iran. We have to do it immediately. We have to redress this situation. They know that the Director General of the IAEA is ready to do that. It's up to them.
The spokesperson for the Iranian Foreign Ministry has said all of this is because of short-sightedness from the United States and from the EU3. Tweeting here, US E3 put their short-sighted agenda ahead of IAEA's credibility by pushing a miscalculated and ill-advised resolution against a country with the world's most transparent, peaceful nuclear program. The initiators are responsible for the consequences. Can you be clear here? Is this a country, Iran, with the world's most transparent, peaceful nuclear program, as you understand it?
Iran is perhaps the most inspected country. This is correct. This is correct. But this is commensurate to the activities that they have. It is also a function of the past JCPOA, and it's also, to a certain extent, a result of a past record and history. We don't have the time now to go into this, but it's a shaky history where with ups and downs and moments where they were not found in compliance with their commitment. That is the past. We want to look into the future. We have a problem now. The problem that we have now is that we need to have certain information, and they are not giving it to us. I'm not having a view on what Iran or others are saying about resolutions or no resolutions. There is a concrete problem here. The problem is that Iran has not been answering a number of questions from the agency. The problem is that Iran is now, instead of increasing cooperation with us, it's curtailing it. So what we are saying basically that this is going against the right direction. But like I said, of course, although this is a very serious step in the wrong direction, there's still time for diplomacy. There's still time for us to sit down and try to redress this. But it is a very serious moment.
Yeah, Iran's response, they say, is firm and proportionate. Let's just hear from the Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, on this.
I commend the International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors for its decision yesterday, a decision which clearly states that Iran is continuing to play games and is continuing to conceal and hide. On the one hand, we see in this decision the lies and the hypocrisy of Iran on the nuclear issue and in general. On the other hand, we see here a firm stance by the countries of the world regarding the distinction between good and evil, as they clearly state that Iran is concealing things. We will not let up on this issue.
You recently traveled to Israel. Do you believe that that trip to Israel aggravated Iran and may have played into, or did play into, the calculation for today's steps by Tehran?
I don't get into that kind of analysis. You know, if I was to talk to people on the basis of third parties' possible reactions to what I would be doing, I would not be able to perform my functions as Director General of an international organization. I think, of course, views, opinions are absolutely legitimate. The important thing is what I do as Director General vis-a-vis countries, including Iran, and what Iran does with regards to its own responsibilities and its own legal obligations. That is what matters. If we start having serious, grave political decisions on the basis of visits or opinions or views or quotes, then we are in deep trouble. So again, what we need to do is to work, and Iran knows what they need to do.
3 to 4 weeks, you say, is the window. If that passes, that will deal a fatal blow to the deal. Are you suggesting that we have about a month before this crisis escalates into new uncharted territory? And if so, what are your fears about that territory?
Let me say, my estimation is not a political one. It's a technical one. My estimation is based on the relative time we can afford to not have access to this type of information. In other words, the amount of time we can have with the centrifuges spinning, with the heavy water production continuing, with the construction and assembly of centrifuges ongoing without us having a view on that. Because
and your view would be what? Your view
within
would
this
be
time,
what if they were allowed to do that without
more or less
verification?
Let me explain. We could more or less reconstruct. We could more or less reconstruct what may have happened, but these projections are something that you do for a relatively short period of time. You cannot go for months and months without any access, without any information, and then say, well, you know, there is this amount probably. So this is why we're saying 3-4 weeks is something we could handle. So it's not a political, I leave this to the politicians. This is a technical assessment by the IAEA, yes.
But that's extremely important. You are saying that you need oversight, or you need to be able to verify what's going on. If you don't, within 3 to 4 weeks, you are clearly concerned about what Iran will be achieving with its nuclear program, correct?
I will be concerned about not being able to confirm what they have or what they do not have. This is the point.
Are you speaking to your Iranian counterparts right now, and are you planning on visiting Tehran?
I hope we can do that. I certainly hope we can do that. We are saying things with the gravity they deserve. At the same time, we are saying there is time, there is a margin that we should put to the best possible use starting now.
So it's good to have you on. Please stay in touch.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure to talk.
Rafael Grossi for you. Well, just ahead, Russia's war on Ukraine is sparking a new warning of more hunger across the world. I'll bring you team coverage on that up next. You could call it the Hunger Games, the real ones, unfolding across the world as we speak. The UN says the food crisis sparked by Russia's invasion of Ukraine means 47 million people could face what it calls acute food insecurity this year. That is serious hunger. At the same time, a separatist leader says the first railway shipments of Ukrainian grain have left an occupied region in the south. Russian media quoted him as saying they are going through Crimea in the direction of the Middle East. Russia says it has no grain deals with the Middle East, or Turkey for that matter, but it's working on it. Moscow also denying accusations it's been stealing massive amounts of Ukrainian grain. And Kyiv has other big worries, including the fighting in eastern Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelensky says the fate of the entire Donbass region is being decided in Severodonetsk. This comes as local officials say Russia now controls most of that key eastern city. Well, CNN's Claire Sebastian has been looking at this food crisis from here in London. You've been on this beat now for, more than 3 months that this war has been ongoing. Let's talk about this grain. There seemed to be quite some confusion as to what is going on here. As we understand it, grain is being taken out of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Who's taking it? Where's it going? And who's paying for it?
Yeah, it's murky. I mean, this is the fog of war in a lot of ways. What we have today is that Ukraine is saying that Russia is taking it, at least a portion of it. The Agrarian Council says that 600,000 tons has been stolen. That's over the past few months. Roughly the same number came from the Deputy Agrarian Minister who just spoke to Julia Chatterley. And have a listen to him because he talks about evidence for what exactly is happening to it.
Unfortunately, we have the situation where about 500,000 tons of grain has been stolen by Russians on the partly occupied territories of Ukraine. We do know this because we have received the information from the people on the elevators that Russians came, just took this grain, came with military power. And also we have the video and photo effects of cars and rail cars bringing this grain towards the direction of Russia or occupied Crimea.
He then says that from occupied Crimea, they have evidence, satellite images that show it being taken to other countries. And CNN has uncovered similar evidence of that. Accounts from farmers, Ukrainian officials, shipping sources have shown that it is in certain quantities being taken out of Ukraine. And the extraordinary thing today, Becky, is that we then have these comments, one from the head of the Russian military administration in occupied Zaporizhia, who said that the first rail shipments of grain left the occupied town of Melitopol going to Crimea. He hopes they would find their way to Turkey and the Middle East. And as you said, the Kremlin spokesman said that there aren't deals yet with Turkey and the Middle East, but they are working on it. So it is murky, but extraordinary that Russia could be talking about that openly.
Yeah, and just to be quite clear, before I get to Kyiv and to Salma Abdelaziz, our correspondent on the ground there, we know Ukraine produces much of the world's grain, and we know that there is a serious concern now about a global food crisis. When we talk about 500,000 tons of grain is what's being suggested by the Ukrainians being stolen, allegedly, by the Russians, how significant is that?
So it's not huge in terms of the annual harvest of Ukraine. I think was about 80 million tons in 2021. The amount, actually, this is more significant in terms of world hunger, is the amount trapped in storage in Ukraine, which is estimated to be about 20 million tons. So the amount being stolen isn't a huge amount so far, but we're hearing from Russian officials in the occupied area saying that they hope that more could be done. So it looks like it could become part of a pattern, and it doesn't build trust for these negotiations. No. That is the problem here.
No, absolutely. And we know those grain silos are full. I mean, the grain exists despite the fact that the farmers are struggling at present, and there's obviously the issue of whether this summer harvest will actually come good. But the grain does exist. It's in those silos, ready to be shipped. It's just a question of who's getting hold of it and where it's going at this point. Thank you. Let's get you to the ground and to Salma Abdelaziz, as promised. We've been talking about the Ukrainian grain story. You've got more on what's going on the ground, as I understand it. What's the story there?
Absolutely. Let's start with Severodonetsk. Of course, that is the flashpoint city right now. President Zelensky says the fate of the Donbass region, that is the crucial region that Russia is trying to take control of, the fate of it lies in that battle. And that battle is quite simply not going the way of Ukrainian forces. Last night, they say there were fierce artillery rounds, shelling, hitting of Ukrainian positions. They've been forced to retreat to fortified locations, essentially a strategic retreat, according to Ukraine Ukrainian forces, they say they are catastrophically short of artillery rounds. They are outmanned. They are outgunned. A superior Russian artillery force has been pounding them, grinding these Ukrainian forces for weeks now. It is hard to imagine, Becky, how they can continue to hold Severodonetsk for much longer. The best, really, that it looks like Ukrainian forces can hope for is to drag this out, is to drag out Russian resources. And why does this matter? Let's pull up that map. Why does Severodonetsk matter? It is the last, essentially, the last stronghold in the Luhansk Republic. So in that region, if Severodonetsk falls, you are just that one step closer to the larger goal President Putin has of controlling the Donbass region. And let's keep that map up, because regardless of whether or not Severodonetsk is taken, Russia is creating facts on the ground, realities on the ground, and that is a land bridge. And this was part of the goal in the invasion of Ukraine, a land bridge that connects Russia all the way down to Crimea, through the Donbass, through those occupied regions of Kherson and Mariupol, down to the warm water ports on the Black Sea. Those would be the only warm water ports that would function year-round for Russia. And that's already happening, Becky, regardless of whether the international community recognizes it, because Russia is rebuilding the infrastructure. Already hundreds of miles of railways rebuilt. They say there's a steady rail traffic now between Russia down to the region of Crimea. They're reopening the ports in Mariupol and Berdyansk, an important canal that was in Kherson, which is now again Russian occupied during this conflict. That provides fresh water to Crimea. So what Russia is doing is, again, creating facts on the ground, building the infrastructure, owning and occupying and running these territories, whether or not the international community recognizes it. So when and if Russia comes to the negotiating table, those are the realities on the ground. Of course, Ukraine, for its part, trying to claw back every bit of territory it can, but it's really holding off here a much bigger, much more powerful military. Becky.
And when you speak to people on the ground, you're in Kyiv, for example, when you speak to people on the ground, that's some distance away, of course, from the real front lines, as it were, at this point. Although when we spoke to you this time yesterday, there were sirens going off behind you, so we can't forget that there is aggressive behaviour still by the Russians in other parts of Ukraine. What are people telling you about how they believe this might end?
Becky, this is a moment of extraordinary national unity. President Zelensky, in particular, who has addressed his countrymen nearly every single day. He's spoken on every single detail in this conflict. He's been an absolutely unifying force. And for Ukrainians, they are not willing to give up an inch. To them, absolutely any concessions to Russia is quite simply appeasement to President Putin, to someone that they see, again, President Putin, as an appetite that will not end, that will not cease. It would be appeasement to give those territories away. So we're looking at the realities on the ground here, but at the same time, you have a Ukraine that is absolutely steadfast that they are not going to give up their territories to any Russian forces, regardless of where the tanks are placed.
Salma Abdelaziz is on the ground in Ukraine. Claire with me here in the studio. To both of you, thank you. Well, this just into CNN. 2 British citizens and a Moroccan man have been sentenced to death by a pro-Russian court in what's known as the Donetsk People's Republic in eastern Ukraine. Russian media reporting that the 3 men are accused of being mercenaries for Ukraine. The men were captured by Russian forces in mid-April in Mariupol. Well, we know, and we've been discussing, the impact of this war is not just on the Ukrainian people, but it is global at this point through the price of fuel and food. And for the first time in more than a decade, the European Central Bank plans to raise interest rates. The bank just announced it would leave the current rate for banks to deposit money with the central bank overnight at -0.5%. That negative number is basically a penalty for not lending the money. The ECB says, though, it will likely raise rates 0.25 percentage point next month. And the goal there is to rein in this inflation that's been creeping up since last year, to be quite frank, but worse, of course, worsened by this war in Ukraine. It's now at a record 8.1% and growing. One place that has been particularly hard hit by inflation is Italy. Barbie Nadeau joining us now from Rome with that part of the story. And the ECB decision, of course, will affect people in Italy. This decision coming for the Eurozone as opposed to the US and the UK, of course. What do you expect people will make of that in Italy?
Well, you know, it's always different. What's good for the institutions isn't always good for the people. And we've been trying to understand how people are affected by this inflation. We've been talking to people who are producing the food, trying not to pass on the extra cost to the consumers. Let's hear what we found.
Signora, buonasera. Spaghetti al pomodoro.
Grazie.
Prego.
This is the quintessential Italian meal, spaghetti with tomato. But the price of this Italian staple has increased tremendously over the last year. To understand why the cost to produce pasta from durum wheat and tomato sauce from fresh tomatoes has gone up, we went directly to the source. Here at the Maestri Pastai pasta factory in southern Italy, owner Valentina Castiello tells us the price of some of the raw materials to make her pasta have jumped by 100%. She tells us her company is trying to find ways to absorb the excess, but some of it will go to the consumer.
We have increased the price of our final product by 30%. The cost is high, but the consumer continues to buy the affordable products that everyone can use at home.
The average Italian eats around 50 pounds of pasta every year. Castiello says to confront the rising cost of living, distributors are actually buying more inventory from her factory. Because even if the price of pasta goes up, it is still by far the most affordable way for many Italians to put food on the table. The rising costs range from packaging to electricity to fuel to transport these goods. But it isn't just pasta makers struggling to produce economical food. At this tomato farm near Rome that Dalila Marasca owns with her father and brother, things aren't much easier. She tells us that fertilizer costs alone have risen 150% over last year. They had to make a drastic decision to reduce the number of tomatoes they planted by 40% because they have no idea what the market will be like when these new tomato plants are ready to harvest. Marasca says the tomato is the base of the Italian diet, during the summer as fresh produce and during the other seasons as canned products. The factors driving the prices of these fundamental Italian ingredients are complicated. First came the pandemic, then Russia's war in Ukraine, and now the uncertainty of what's next. And you know, Becky, when you look at that, you know, all the components that go into such a simple meal, we're not talking about luxury items, we're not talking about meat and fish or caviar, you know, we're talking about basic pasta and tomato. And if that's being affected already by the war and the other factors, it's hard to imagine what's coming around the corner. Becky?
Fascinating. Thank you, Barbie. Next hour, we're going to take a look at the factors pushing the global economy to the brink. I'll speak with Maurice Obstfeld, economic professor and former chief economist at the International Monetary Fund. A story that affects us all. Well, after nearly a year of secret work and thousands of interviews behind closed doors, the panel investigating the January the 6th attack on the US Capitol finally goes public today. The first of at least 6 hearings is headed to primetime TV in just a matter of hours. We will preview what American viewers and indeed the rest of the world can expect. Welcome back. I'm Becky Anderson in London. You're watching Connect the World. This show is out of London this week, where the time is 3:30. More than 500 days after the storming of the US Capitol building, it's a critical and historic moment for American democracy. The US public and the world can tune in to watch as the special US House committee investigating the January 6th attack will begin to lay out its case on prime-time television. The panel says it will use this first of at least 6 hearings to make the case that former President Donald Trump was at the centre of a coordinated, multi-step effort to overturn Joe Biden's 2020 election win. It'll also try to connect the dots between Mr. Trump's election lies and the violence that unfolded that day. The committee plans to show clips of private interviews with Trump aides, campaign officials and members of his inner circle. There will also be, we are told, never-before-seen footage of the attack to remind people of what is at stake. And we expect to hear live witness testimony from 2 people who had an up-close view of the rioters. CNN's Pamela Brown has more.
After a nearly year-long investigation, the January 6th committee is preparing to share their findings with the American people. And they are zeroing in on one man, former President Trump.
I think that Donald Trump and the White House were at the center of these events. That's the only way, really, of making sense of them all.
From the beginning, the investigation has focused on the unprecedented efforts by Trump and his allies to try to stop the transfer of power to President Joe Biden. While Trump was impeached by the House just days after the riot for inciting the pro-Trump insurrectionists, the committee says it's uncovered more since then.
The Select Committee has found evidence about a lot more than incitement here.
The committee has interviewed more than 1,000 witnesses behind closed doors, including Jared Kushner, Ivanka Trump, Donald Trump Jr., Rudy Giuliani, former Attorney General Bill Barr, and obtained more than 135,000 documents.
We must also know what happened every minute of that day in the White House. Every phone call, every conversation, every meeting leading up to, during, and after the attack.
The committee is clearly signaling to the Justice Department, which holds the power to charge Trump with a crime related to January 6th.
Do you believe it was a conspiracy?
I do. It is extremely broad. It's extremely well organized. It's really chilling.
Just this week, a federal judge again flagged possible evidence of a crime. That same judge issued a landmark ruling earlier this year, finding it was more likely than not that Trump and a conservative lawyer committed a crime and strategizing to overturn the election. Trump has not been charged with a crime and has denied any wrongdoing. He continues to downplay his involvement in the deadly insurrection while bashing the committee's work as another, quote, witch hunt.
January 6th, what a lot of crap. It's another con job, just like Russia.
But for 187 minutes, committee members say Trump was derelict in his duty, watching TV, and seemingly pleased supporters were fighting for him, even as Republicans pleaded for Trump to intervene in text messages to his White House chief of staff.
It is a roadmap, and I would have to say at this point, I think Mark Meadows is the MVP for the committee.
Denver Riggleman advised the committee, helping to decode Meadows' texts among the more than 2,300 messages obtained by CNN. Donald Trump Jr. texting, he's got to condemn this shit ASAP. Meadows responding, I am pushing it hard, I agree. But it took Trump over 3 hours to release this recorded video.
So go home. We love you. You're very special.
When you look at the totality of the evidence, it's pretty apparent that at some points President Trump knew what was going on.
Well, the hearings are not only expected to explore efforts to overturn the election results, but also the role of far-right extremist groups. 1 month after the election, Trump tweeted about the protest in D.C. on January 6th. The following day, the Proud Boys began to plan for the rally, knowing they might have to break the law to stop the certification of votes. That's according to a plea agreement from one member of the Proud Boys who is now cooperating with the federal investigation. The DOJ escalating that criminal case this week, charging several leaders with seditious conspiracy. Pamela Brown, CNN, Washington.
A little more on this. Daniela Diaz has the latest from the Capitol. Aides say the panel will reveal new evidence that will help, quote, connect the dots between President Trump's election lies and his attempt to overturn the election. What sort of evidence might we see in these hearings starting tonight?
Becky, remember, this is going to be the first time we're actually seeing the committee in public, and they will present this evidence that of these interviews they've been doing for the last couple of months. They've been working diligently behind closed doors, interviewing many witnesses related to former President Donald Trump. And this is going to play out in a very interesting way. First, we're going to hear from Chairman Benny Thompson of the committee. He plans to give an opening statement. Then we'll also hear from Republican and ranking member Liz Cheney. She plans to give an opening statement, and the two of them will be the ones leading this hearing and doing most of the questioning in this hearing with the witnesses. Another thing is we're expecting this to play out in three different ways, three different distinct things that we will see later tonight. First off, we expect to see never before seen footage of the violence of that day. Of course, there were a lot of people recording what happened that day, and we expect to see some new footage from that, new evidence. We also expect to see some footage from the behind closed doors interviews and depositions that the committee has been working on for the past couple of months very privately. And we also expect testimony from two individuals, one of them being Caroline Edwards. She is actually a U.S. Capitol Police officer who was injured that day, the first to be injured, and suffered a traumatic brain injury. And another being the documentary filmmaker Nick Quested. He is expected to display an array of what he saw firsthand that day when he was embedded with the rioters. So it's really going to be an important day for this question of what happened on January 6th. Was it a really terrible day for democracy? And the point being that this committee really wants to educate Americans of that day and how terrible it was, and see if maybe, just maybe, they're able to really imprint that day in Americans' minds. Remember, this is a prime time here in the United States, prime time hearing that will take place and will be aired on and live streamed in this country.
Described by one as a TV spectacular that will blow the roof off. Well, be sure, thank you, Daniela, to tune in for live coverage of the January the 6th committee hearings starting 7 p.m. on Thursday in Washington. That is 3 in the morning on Friday in Abu Dhabi, midnight here in London, right here on CNN. Well, US President Joe Biden is tackling a host of issues with his regional counterparts at the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles, amongst them the influx of migrants at the US's borders. As we speak, a caravan of 5,000 people making their way through north through Mexico. Save the Children asking for special protection and medical attention for about 1,000 children who are amongst those in the caravan. Now, to tackle this humanitarian and political issue, President Biden will need the cooperation of several countries, including Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador and Guatemala. However, the leaders of those nations are either not invited or are boycotting the summit over the exclusion of Cuba, Nicaragua and Venezuela because of their human rights records and autocratic governments. We're going to take a very short break. Back after this, please. Well, this just into CNN. CNN has learned that the PGA Tour has suspended 17 golfers who are currently playing in the Live Golf Series just outside of London or plan to in the future. Some of them big names, including Dustin Johnson and Phil Mickelson. The PGA saying their players made their choice to take part in the Saudi-backed league for, quote, financial reasons. Well, Amanda Davis is here for more on this. I know you're going to do it in World Sport. This just coming into us. Just how significant is this?
This is big. I mean, the PGA Tour had threatened retaliation, and that is exactly what they've issued within minutes of these players taking to the course. That was what they were waiting for. Alex Thomas is going to be live from the Centurion Club for us in just a couple of minutes in World Sport.
The first of a series of events in this Live tournament. Thank you for that. Stay with us for World Sport. That story after this.
Hi, thanks for joining us. Welcome along to World Sport live from London with me, Amanda Davis. Some breaking news to start the show. The start of play was never going to end the controversy. The PGA Tour had threatened action, and now that the players have taken to the course of the Saudi-backed breakaway Live Golf Invitational Series, the PGA Tour have announced their retaliation, banning all of the stars who have signed up. In a statement issued by PGA Tour Commissioner Jay Monahan within the last hour, the US-based golf body have said that they're implementing the sanction on, quotes, those players who have decided to turn their backs on the PGA Tour by willfully violating a regulation. So let's cross live to the Centurion Club and join my World Sport colleague, Alex Thomas. Alex, things are getting spicy, aren't they? How would you describe that PGA Tour response?
Absolutely brutal. That was the nuclear option, and they have taken it. There's no doubt that there was a simmering fury about the 2-page, 9-paragraph memo that PGA Tour Commissioner Jay Monahan had clearly got ready in advance, couldn't issue it until the players had done something wrong. So when they teed off in a shotgun start, so all of them together at 2:15 p.m. local time here at the Centurion Club just outside London, within minutes that memo was dropped to chosen media and then soon made publicly available under an embargo. We'll get to that in a moment, but the Live Golf response was almost just as swift, saying today's announcement by the PGA Tour is vindictive and it deepens the divide between the Tour and its members. It's troubling that the Tour, an organisation dedicated to creating opportunities for golfers to play the game, is the entity blocking golfers from playing. This certainly is not the last word on this topic. The era of free agency is beginning, as we are proud to have a full field of players joining us in London and beyond. Let me highlight the crucial paragraph from Jay Monahan, the PGA Tour Commissioner's memo. There's a kind of mafia-like response, a "you are dead to me" vibe going on. It was addressed to the PGA Tour members as if to say, I don't ever want to hear from you guys that have quit the tour. The crucial paragraph is this. This week, the RBC Canadian Open is a shining example of what you have created with the PGA Tour. A star-studded field, a committed sponsor, sold-out hospitality offerings, record crowds, and a global broadcast distribution. These elements are part of the tour's DNA, built by the likes of Jack and Arnie, furthered by Tiger and countless others whose legacies are inextricably linked with each other and with the PGA Tour. This collective legacy can't be bought or sold. A huge explicit dig about the money here on the Live Golf Series, backed by the billions of dollars of Saudi Arabia's public investment fund. Money, money, money was another phrase elsewhere in the memo. Professional men's golf, Amanda, is in all-out civil war.
Yeah, really fascinating, isn't it? That the use of just the players identified by the single word, like Tiger. Really, really fascinating stuff. Of course, the players that this affects, though, are still out on the course, aren't they? What do you think the reaction from them will be? Has anything been trickling through as yet?
I think we can now say that when Phil Mickelson refused to discuss what the PGA Tour sanctions would be in his press conference on Tuesday, I think it's because he knew what was coming. Let's hear what he did actually say.
I've gained a lot. I've received a lot from the PGA Tour. I'm very grateful for that. I'm grateful for everything the PGA Tour and the game of golf has provided for me and my family. I've also worked really hard to contribute and try to build and add value to the tour during my time there. And I worked really hard to earn a lifetime exemption. And I don't want to give that up. I don't believe I should have to.
Live Golf initially tried to work with the PGA Tour and Europe's DP World Tour. They didn't want to have anything to do with it, but they also said they would back any players who joined them and then had to face legal action. Mickelson's the prime candidate, but so too, Amanda, are the players who quit the PGA Tour, because the PGA Tour punishment, which said you can't play in any of their competitions, also mentioned the players that are quit. So they can't take sponsor invites. They think they're free agents. It's heading for the courts.
And we're still, of course, waiting for any response from the DP World Tour, formerly the European Tour. This is very much just beginning, isn't it, Alex? For now, thanks very much indeed. Well, after Game 3 of the NBA Finals, the Golden State Warriors find themselves down. But are they and Steph Curry out? Find out after the break.
They're small, they're unathletic.
Welcome back. The players were putting their bodies on the line quite literally in Game 3 of the NBA Finals, and what proved a disappointing night in Boston for the Golden State Warriors. Not only were they beaten, But Steph Curry was left limping, and he is in a race against time to get back to fitness with Game 4 in less than 48 hours. The Boston crowd made sure to make their presence felt for the Celtics' first home game of their final series with the Warriors, and it really made an impact. The Celtics running up an 18-point lead at one point, fueled by a franchise record-tying finals first quarter by Jaylen Brown, scoring 17 of his 27. The Celtics showing their fighting spirit. They have not lost in back-to-back games for this entire postseason. Boston's trio of Brown, Jason Tatum and Marcus Smart combining for 77 points in a 116-100 win.
Just being focused and locked in and everybody competing and being on the same page. We're going to need that, obviously, to get the job done.
What we hang our hat on is effort on the defensive end and being a physical team. So it definitely woke us up a little bit. And we just want to come out and, if we were going to come out here and play, the last thing when we left that court, we didn't want to say, well, we weren't physical enough. And it worked out for us.
Well, despite Steph Curry dropping a game-high 31 points, the defeat means the Warriors have lost 4 of the last 5 road playoff games. That was the scary moment for the two-time league MVP late in the fourth quarter. He scrambled for a loose ball. His foot trampled on by Celtics' Al Horford, all 240 pounds of him. He was at the bottom of the pile, pinned down in pain. But Curry says he should be okay for Game 4.
I'll be all right. Excuse me. It was, I got caught underneath Al. Obviously, be some pain, but I'll be all right. Figure out how it feels tomorrow and get ready for Friday.
I saw him getting dove on, and that was about that. So I picked up my foul, pushing him off of him because he's screaming at the bottom of the pile. So yeah, it is what it is. I'll take the foul. I'm gonna get him off his legs though. So it's all good.
You can see what Draymond Green's son thought of things. Now, the head of police in Paris has apologised to fans who attended last month's Champions League final, saying there was, quote, obviously a failure in the procedures. Both Liverpool and Real Madrid demanded an inquiry after supporters were targeted with tear gas by French police ahead of kick-off as chaos reigned outside the Stade de France, with thousands of ticket holders struggling to gain access to the stadium in time for kick-off. And speaking to the French Senate, Paris Police Chief Didier Lallemant has said he takes full responsibility for police management, adding, people were pushed or assaulted when we owed them safety. He said the image of the country has been shaken. Now, just 4 days after seeing their World Cup dreams ended by Wales, Ukraine's players regrouped to produce a victory over the Republic of Ireland in UEFA's Nations League. Like in Scotland and Wales in recent weeks, Ukraine were given a brilliant reception at Lansdowne. That is just about it, though, from myself and the team for now. Just before we go, as legend has it, the Rolex Giralja is an event that was created over dinner in Paris back in December 1952. And this week, it celebrates its 69th edition. Here's more in our Rolex Minute. See you next time. Goodbye.
Live from CNN London, this is Connect the World with Becky Anderson.
Well, I'm Becky Anderson in London. Hello and welcome back to Connect the World. It is a busy hour of news. We begin with this just in to CNN in the last hour. Death sentences handed down for 2 British citizens and a Moroccan man in a pro-Russian court in what's known as the Donetsk People's Republic in eastern Ukraine. Russian media reporting that the 3 men are being accused of being mercenaries. We're also learning that Ukrainian fighters could be on the ropes in eastern Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelensky says the fate of the entire Donbass region is being decided in Severodonetsk. This comes as local officials say Russia now controls most of that key eastern city. I want to bring in CNN Selma Abdelaziz live for us from the Ukrainian capital. And let's start with what is breaking news here. What do we know about these 3 men sentenced to death?
So let's just start with who they are. 28-year-old Aiden Aslan, a British national, 48-year-old Sean Pinner, also a British national, and Ibrahim Saidan, a Moroccan national. All 3 men claim that they were members of the Ukrainian armed forces, and they say they should be protected, of course, as prisoners of war under the Geneva Conventions. Now, the Donetsk People's Republic, this independent separatist breakaway state that is only recognized by Russia and not recognized by the international community, has accused these men of being mercenaries, of planning acts of terrorism. Now, the story in particular of Aiden Aslan and Sean Pinner has been splashed across the UK media now for months. Aiden Aslan's family has accused Russian forces of beating him, of violating Geneva Conventions, of torturing him. There was video released weeks after they were captured, and these 3 men, just to clarify, were captured in Mariupol in April, where they were fighting alongside Ukrainian armed forces. That's according to British officials, according to their families. They were captured in April, fighting alongside Ukrainian armed forces. Aiden Aslan's family accusing these Russian-backed separatists of violating Geneva Conventions, of beating Aiden Aslan. Of course, their fate is now something of high concern for British officials. We have reached out to the families for comment. They have yet to respond. UK officials say they are doing everything they can to try to bring these men to safety, and watch groups say that the Donetsk People's Republic, this separatist-backed government, has an appalling record of human rights. They appeared, again, these 3 men in a prison, in a detention facility, in what appeared to in a court, essentially, being handed down these sentences. Human rights groups are concerned that they're essentially being used here as a token by Russian forces, as a bartering chip, if you will. We'll wait to find out more on their fate, Becky.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, stay on the story for us. Thank you for that. Ukraine's military says to win this war, it needs more powerful, longer-range weapons. It's getting new shipments from the US and from NATO allies. But we are hearing that one piece of artillery has indeed had a devastating impact on Russian positions. CNN's Matthew Chance reports from close to the front line in southern Ukraine. Have a look at this.
These are just some of the powerful American guns now on the Ukrainian front lines, meant to make a critical difference in the war with Russia. Of course, they might be targeted at any moment. Media access to them is highly sensitive and rare.
All right, well, we've been taken here very close to the front lines in southern Ukraine, where we're being shown these US-provided long-range artillery systems. It's an M777. According to Ukrainian military officials that we've spoken to, the US has so far supplied approximately 90 of these weapons, and many of them are already being used on the front line, including in this area here in the south of Ukraine, pounding Russian positions.
We were only shown a training exercise, but Ukrainian military officials say these are exclusive images of the same weapons in action just this week, firing on Russian forces more than 20 miles away. Including on this Grad multiple rocket launcher they say had been targeting civilian areas. Ukrainian aerial footage shows the Grad being destroyed, its ammunition exploding after a direct hit. Ukrainian artillery troops say their guns are now giving them an edge, and their Russian counterparts are feeling the pain.
Yes, they definitely notice as we became faster and more precise. They are not able to keep up with us as they are operating old Soviet guns, which are heavier, less precise, slower, and difficult to use. These guns are objectively the best in the world, and when we started using them, our efficiency rose tremendously.
It's giving the Ukrainian military an advantage, they say, on the battlefield, because these weapons are much lighter, much more accurate than they've used before, much more mobile as well. And it's giving them the edge, they say, to try and help them push back Russian forces all along this region. But of course, the complaint, if you can call it a complaint, is that they want more of this. They want more weapons like this, and they want even longer range rocket systems, which have already been promised, of course, by the United States, to push back the Russians even further.
And Ukrainian authorities are likely to need more guns still to hold them back. With no end to this conflict, the demand for US weapons may be endless too. Matthew Chance, CNN, in southern Ukraine.
Well, on day 106 of this war, another big number is emerging, 47 million. That is how many more people the war in Ukraine could push into acute food insecurity, according to the United Nations. Now, that comes on top of 276 million people the World Food Programme estimates were already facing acute hunger before this war began. And this is important because, according to Ukraine's president, it's not just the war itself that is causing this food crisis. President Zelensky is accusing Russia of stealing Ukraine's grain, which much of the world depends on, of course. And you can see the numbers here on your screen. Russia has vehemently denied those accusations, and a Russian-backed leader in Ukraine says the first rail cars carrying Ukrainian grain from the occupied city of Melitopol left for Crimea. He says he hopes the grain finds its way to Turkey and to the Middle East. Well, my next guest says, and I quote, "This war has no winner. The impact of the war in Ukraine across the region and the world is far-reaching. Food insecurity is set to become even more worrying, with 1.7 billion people at risk of increased poverty due to this crisis." Amin Awad, the UN Crisis Coordinator for Ukraine, joins me now live from the capital, Kyiv. There are a number of big numbers here. You're on the ground. Is there evidence, have you seen evidence, that Russia is stealing Ukrainian grain?
Well, we get this information from open sources. We do not have a mechanism to really verify this. We're not in these areas where this incident may have happened. But I think the picture is bigger than the 400,000 to 500,000 that I've heard. What we have at stake here is 20 million tons of Ukrainian food, that's grain, that need to be exported. This country produces up to 80 million tons of grain a year. Between last year and until February, 40 to 50 million tons have been transported. Now we have 20 million tons that have to be transported to really continue feeding the world and the 20-something countries that depend on Ukrainian grain.
And that 20 million tons of Ukrainian grain sitting in silos waiting to be exported, and as you rightly pointed out, that puts that staying where it is puts not just Ukrainians but the rest of the world in a really difficult position as far as food security is concerned. Russia has said that the first rail cars carrying some of that Ukrainian grain from the occupied city of Melitopol has left for Crimea, and they say that's in the hopes of reaching Turkey and the Middle East. Again, let's just drill down on what we know at this point. Is that something that you can confirm, that 500,000 tons of grain is actually on the move?
Well, that's what I hear in the news. I do not have a mechanism really to confirm this. But what I can tell you is that's a drop in the ocean, if you look at that. Also from here, from this side, Ukraine started to export grain through Poland and other countries, trying to reach the Black Sea or the Baltic Sea to export. But that is 10% of what they will really export every year. This country needs 100 ships to transport a month, 100 ships a month to transport 5 million tons a month through it is 7 ports in the Black Sea. That's what happened traditionally. And that need to continue, that need to resume. Now the negotiation is between Russia and Ukraine by the UN and with Turkey also being also a mediator and an observer in all of this. So we really hope that this deal concludes very quickly. And the food is not, the war in Ukraine did not only aggravate the food crisis, it aggravated also an energy crisis, financial crisis, and a supply chain crisis. All, if you combine all of those, we really have a disaster in the making, and this needs to be really sorted out as soon as possible. And it does not only depends on their convergence here. It's not only the Ukrainian grain. Also, Russia should export it is food and it is fertilizer. That's another shortage that the world is facing, fertilizers. So the world is not in a good place when you look at finances, when you look at inflation, between 9% to 13% shortage of food, no fertilizers. What's going to happen between now and the end of the year, and what's going to happen even next year?
Yeah.
So this is really need the efforts of everybody, and this issue ought to be depoliticized, and space should be given to the United Nations initiative by the Secretary General and other entities that are involved in this, for this really to go forward as soon as possible. There is no time to waste, really, and winter is around the corner.
The accusation is that Russia is using food as a weapon of war. That is a serious accusation. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, you see the accusation and counter-accusation at a time where we're trying to come up with a very pragmatic solutions, for the real issues that the world is facing. I cannot really comment on each side, posture as far as all of this. But I know that the world have agreed, including Russia on the one hand and the rest, that there ought to be a solution to the food crisis and the fertilizer crisis, so that we do not have a serious problem in the world today. So I hope that really happens, and I want to concentrate really and focus on the issues before us with a view to really find solutions, practical solutions, operational ones, so that we can see the ships coming back to the Black Sea and sailing away with millions of tons of Ukrainian food. Russian food.
I understand that I know that you could answer that question with an assessment. I understand that you don't want to at this point. But let's then discuss what you believe can or should happen next. 47 million more people could become acutely food insecure from this war. That's on top of more than 250 million who were already food insecure before this war. Those numbers are absolutely horrific. What is your plan, the UN's plan, to fix this?
Horrifying numbers. And as I said, if the situation is aggravated, this is what we know now. But if the situation continues, if this impasse continues for more weeks or months, the situation will be worse. And the 1.7 billion people that the Secretary General's report talked about could be a reality now. We are in fragile states, states in transition, states with high population, the big numbers that we have seen in Africa, in Asia. Those who are also importing food from Ukraine include Egypt, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan. These are countries with a sizable number of population, and the countries that are importing Ukraine food are all middle income or low income countries. So the situation will be horrible, and it will be compounded also not only because of the food crisis, because of the war, energy, yes, food shortages, financial disruptions, supply chain disruptions. All of that is going to really contribute to unprecedented crisis that the world will take the brunt of it, and not only the developing world. I think all corners of the world will have that. Also, as I said earlier, very clear that the sanctions do not include the exempt food, in this war and between the parties, including Russia, as far as food and fertilizers. And these have to really also be put into the overall context of shortage of food, famine on our doorsteps, and disruption of services when it comes to supply chain and distribution of food. So the stakes are very high, and there ought to be a solution to this. Here in Ukraine, we're also facing other challenges. We are entering winter in about 10 weeks' time. There was disruption to power supply, be it fuel, electricity, what have you. We have 14 million people displaced internally and externally. The first such disruption we haven't seen in history, not even during World War II. And people will be facing freezing winter. We have to think of alternative energy sources. We have to think of winterization. We're expecting up to 5 million people to be exposed in many areas of Ukraine. So we really have gigantic challenges here that we have to work around.
Sir, you've got a lot to do on the ground. We appreciate your time. I appreciate you being as candid as you feel you can be. It's clearly a deteriorating situation and one that needs urgent attention. Thank you for joining us this hour.
Thank you.
I want to move on at this point. Iran turning off more than 24 cameras that give international monitors access to its nuclear program. Now, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency says this could deal a, quote, fatal blow to the Iran nuclear agreement. Tehran released this video showing monitoring cameras being turned off at nuclear sites earlier. The IAEA chief, Rafael Grossi, says Iran is planning to remove 27 of these cameras at sites, and Iran says it has already started expanding its underground uranium enrichment. Now, Grossi told me last hour that there is a 3 to 4 week window to salvage the monitoring and, indeed, the deal itself. Have a listen.
My estimation is not a political one. It's a technical one. My estimation is based on the relative time we can afford to not have access to this type of information. In other words, the amount of time we can have with the centrifuges spinning, with the heavy water production continuing, with the construction and assembly of centrifuges ongoing without us having a view on that. Because
and your view would be what?
Happens,
your view would be what if they were allowed to do that without
more or less,
verification?
Let's explain. We could more or less reconstruct. We could more or less reconstruct what may have happened, but these projections are something that you do for a relatively short period of time. You cannot go for months and months without any access, without any information, and then say, well, you know, there is this amount probably. So this is why we're saying 3-4 weeks is something we could handle. So it's not a political, I leave this to the politicians. This is a technical assessment by the IAEA.
Well, that was the IAEA Director General Rafi Grossi speaking with me last hour. Well, ahead on the show, the UK's plan to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda is being challenged in court. But with the first plane load set to depart next week, we'll look at how Rwanda is preparing. update now on a major development from the world of golf. The PGA Tour has suspended golfers taking part in the new Saudi-backed LIV tournament, as it's known. This first ever LIV golf event kicked off near London just a short time ago, and it involved some of the biggest names in golf. Alex Thomas joining me now live from St Albans, England. We have heard in the past hour that the PGA has suspended a number of golfers. These are really high-profile characters. What more do we know? Just how significant is this?
Hugely significant, Becky. You know, at some stage, organisers of this new LIV Golf series will want us to start talking about the golf. But that day is not today, after the men's professional game broke out into all-out civil war of words. We knew that in advance of this launch, the PGA Tour had not granted permission for players to come and play in it. They certainly are directing their ire at the billions of dollars of Saudi Arabian money that is backing this project. And that's why in this 9-paragraph, 2-page memo from the PGA Tour Commissioner Jay Monahan to his current players, the ones that have stayed loyal to the PGA Tour, there was one clear focus. Let me read you a bit of this very long, waffly memo that's full of simmering rage. It says, "I'm certain our fans and partners who are surely tired of all this talk of money, money and more money will continue to be entertained and compelled by the world-class competition you display each and every week." The top line of the memo was that all the players that have jumped ship will be banned from all PGA Tour competitions, even the ones that quit their membership before playing here. The LIV Golf response was swift and just as vitriolic. They said today's announcement by the PGA Tour is vindictive and it deepens the divide between the Tour and its members. It's troubling that the Tour, an organisation dedicated to creating opportunities for golfers to play the game, is the entity blocking golfers from playing. This certainly is not the last word on this topic. The era of free agency is beginning as we are proud to have a full field of players joining us in London and beyond. There's no doubt from that final paragraph and sentence, Becky, this is heading for the courts.
Alex Thomas is, well, he's at the event, and as he says, I mean, the event itself would like to start talking about golf as soon as these golfers teed off on the first day, though. This from the PGA. Thank you. Well, campaigners in the UK are launching a court bid to block the government's plans to send asylum seekers to Rwanda. The British government is planning to fly the first plane load of those asylum seekers to the African nation next week. Human rights groups and a civil service trade union are seeking an injunction to keep that plane from leaving. They say the policy is not lawful. Well, CNN's Larry Mado is in the capital of Rwanda, in Kigali, and you've had a first-hand look at how Rwanda is preparing for these asylum seekers. What have you learned?
Becky, we went to this hostel here in Kigali where the migrants are expected. The first ones will be living, and it's not a 5-star hotel, but it's not a dump either. They will have full board accommodation, cleaning, food, some entertainment, a prayer room, some computer labs. And the UK and Rwanda believe this is the way to reform a broken asylum system and break the business of people smugglers, even though there's a lot of opposition to it. But this is what it looks like. These are the final touches at Hope Hostel in Kigali before the first migrants deported from the UK arrive. And so this is the new place waiting for the migrants? Yep. This building that until recently housed the young survivors of the Rwandan genocide has a new purpose. This newly renovated hostel can host up to 100 people, 2 to a room, and sharing communal bathrooms. So this is one sample room?
Yes, this is the one sample room for the first floor. Amenities.
It's got towels, it's got an iron box, it's got a change of sheets.
Yes.
This is where the migrants will live under the watchful eye of Rwandan authorities. The hostel is functional, not luxurious, but the Rwandan government says the migrants will be free here, not in detention like in the UK.
View Kigali.
Officials are also promising healthcare and support for at least 5 years or until they're self-sufficient. But the plan has been widely criticized by many refugee rights groups in the UK, internationally, and here in Rwanda. The main opposition party here says Rwanda shouldn't have to bear the UK's burden.
It is their responsibility
So you think the UK is violating its international obligations by passing that off to Rwanda?
Yes, and we don't see why. We are still struggling of having enough infrastructure, electricity, water, roads, schools, hospitals. We are not the same like UK. We have to think twice.
Rwanda and the UK expect this migrant scheme to disrupt the business of people smugglers. But many international bodies, even the UK, rank Rwanda poorly on some human rights indicators. Critics also say accepting migrants rich countries don't want is cruel and inhumane.
It's cruel and it's inhumane that people are dying in the desert, trying to cross the desert, making these dangerous journeys, drowning in the Mediterranean. We're interested in protecting vulnerable people, and this has been our philosophy for the last 30 years.
We have fast case processing.
Rwanda has also welcomed refugees and asylum seekers evacuated from Libya after unsuccessfully trying to cross to Europe. Orientation has started for the latest arrivals at the Gashora Emergency Transit Center. They're mostly from the Horn of Africa. How do you compare the conditions in the 4 years you spent in Libya and here in Rwanda?
Actually, it is so difficult to compare it because we can say from hell to heaven.
Being in Libya to Rwanda is like coming from hell to heaven.
Yeah.
Zemen is grateful for the peace and freedom in Rwanda, but it's still not his destination of choice. None of the people we spoke to here wanted to stay, even though it's one of the options. Your final goal is still to go to Europe?
Yeah.
Rwanda has become the global market leader in migrant offshoring. After the UK scheme, a deal with Denmark is in the works. It helps clean up Rwanda's image internationally, but some accuse it of trying to paint over a dark reputation. Becky, one of the criticisms of this Rwanda migrant deal with the UK is that these people are being forced to come here. They went to the UK for a reason, and they shouldn't be shipped 4,000 miles away. The other one is that this goes against international law. But Rwandan authorities tell us there is nothing in the Refugee Convention that stops migrants from being shipped to another safe country.
Larry Madoe on the story for you. Thank you. Right, number of competing stories today. You would expect that here on what is a busy news show. One of our top stories, death sentences handed down for 2 British citizens and a Moroccan man in a pro-Russian court in what is known as the Donetsk People's Republic in eastern Ukraine. The British Foreign Secretary has just tweeted this, and I quote, "I utterly condemn the sentences of Aidan Aslin and Sean Pinner held by Russian proxies in eastern Ukraine. They are prisoners of war. This is a sham judgment with absolutely no legitimacy. My thoughts are with the families. We continue to do everything we can to support them. And we will, of course, keep you across this story for any further developments." It's just before 4:30 here in London. Still ahead as the European Central Bank signals a rate hike next month, fuelled in part by the war in Ukraine. We'll speak to a former chief economist at the IMF about the state of the global economy. the first time in more than a decade, the European Central Bank plans to hike interest rates. The ECB says it will likely raise rates by 0.25 percentage point next month to rein in soaring inflation. It also announced significant cuts to its growth forecast, sparked by the war in Ukraine.
Russia's unjustified aggression towards Ukraine continues to weigh on the economy in Europe and beyond. It is disrupting trade, is leading to shortages of materials, and is contributing to high energy and commodity prices. These factors will continue to weigh on confidence and dampen growth, especially in the near term.
Well, that war affecting economic progress worldwide, and the World Bank warns things are going to get worse before they get better. It's just the latest group to sound the alarm on a potential global recession. The bank cutting its growth estimate for this year even further. Last year, the global economy grew 5.7%. This year's growth estimate is now sharply lower to less than 3%. The bank blames a number of problems, including the risk of stagflation. What's that? Well, stagflation is a phenomenon that combines stagnant economic growth with high inflation and high unemployment. Continuing challenges such as the war in Ukraine, supply chain issues, and the continuing waves of coronavirus cases are harming both consumers and employers and could send world markets into a downturn. The World Bank president cautions it could be the worst slowdown in years.
The sharpness of the slowdown is really concerning. We think it's the biggest slowdown of the global economy in 80 years. I think many countries will see a recession in this cycle.
Well, those are ominous words, aren't they? The Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, that's the OECD, also slashing its growth forecast. Its prediction very close to the World Bank's. The OECD's 2022 forecast fell from 4.5% to 3%, with a similar pace expected next year. The organisation says, and I quote, the world is set to see or pay a hefty price for Russia's war against Ukraine. Its Secretary General appeared on CNN yesterday and explained that price.
Earlier this year, economic growth was returning to normal. I mean, the recovery from COVID had been relatively strong and rapid. Yes, it was uneven, and there were also still some downside risks remaining with the pandemic. But, the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine is causing a significant supply shock. It is having a significant negative effect on growth, and it is pushing up inflation higher and for longer.
Energy prices, one of the major issues dragging the global economy lower. They are, of course, pointing higher too. Well, financial giant Goldman Sachs predicting Brent crude will average $140 a barrel over the next 3 months, up from $120 now. The war in Ukraine has prompted many countries to stop buying Russian oil, meaning less of it's on the market, which pushes up prices. Oil industry experts also point to low reserves and low output, even though OPEC is promising a modest bump in production. Well, Goldman Sachs says that'll be the story until the last quarter of 2022. And finally, adding to the global economic woes, COVID-19 lockdowns. Now, they may seem slightly unfamiliar these days, but of course, China is trying its best to reopen its biggest cities. But today, authorities in Beijing's largest district announced the closure of all entertainment venues just days after easing restrictions. That setback due to 3 new locally transmitted COVID cases linked to a bar. Shanghai also hitting some snags in its reopening. Residents there facing new targeted lockdowns after a small outbreak at a hair salon. The struggle ongoing in China to get money flowing again. And to a certain extent, what happens in China these days has such an impact on the global economy. It used to be that, when America sneezed, everybody else caught a cold. But when you consider that the Chinese economy has been, closed effectively for some time, that has a massive impact on what happens elsewhere. The difficulties we've spoken about affecting people in every corner of the globe and causing civil strife. On this show, we've looked at Italy, at China, the United States, many more, connecting them all, the war in Ukraine, rising inflation, COVID-19 and energy prices. If anyone can sort all of this out, it's Maurice Obstfeld. He's the former chief economist at the International Monetary Fund, and he joins us now from Berkeley in California. I honestly didn't expect, if you had asked me this time last year, that we would be considering the sort of issues that you and I will be discussing today. First, let's start with action that is being taken. The ECB hiking interest rates for the first time in more than a decade. How significant is this, sir?
It's usually significant. The ECB has had negative interest rates for 8 years. The struggle for much of that time has been to get inflation to target and to support growth. And now they're facing a perfect storm kind of situation in which there are strong contractionary forces coming from higher energy prices, from the uncertainty surrounding the war, from food prices. Yet with inflation having risen even before this and now rising more sharply, the ECB is forced to worry about those inflationary expectations becoming entrenched and perhaps requiring a much bigger recession later on to tame them. So now they're raising interest rates in the face of contractionary forces, and there will be a slowdown, possibly a recession in the Eurozone as a result.
We have heard from the World Bank president. He has said we are facing the worst global slowdown possibly in 80 years. Do you agree with his assessment?
Well, I think that's a little hyperbolic. We've had some pretty massive global slowdowns in the past. For example, in the early 1980s, as the Fed stepped on the monetary brakes and created a situation of higher global interest rates that indeed helped cause the debt crisis, a lost decade of the 1980s in many developing countries. But the situation now is somewhat analogous to what we were facing then, especially because many countries in the developing world have higher debt levels than before COVID and are therefore more vulnerable.
We've talked about how the war in Ukraine is just exacerbating what was already a very difficult situation. And when I say a very difficult economy, to a certain extent, it was, there were differences between the global south and the global north. But this war in Ukraine, it feels like this is the most globally interconnected issue right now. Is it?
Well, indeed, it is worsening trends that were in place even before the war, namely higher energy prices, higher food prices, which were already threatening slowdowns and social instability in poorer countries, and it magnifies them. This is such a regressive shock in the sense that higher energy prices, higher food prices affect the poor most strongly, and that's what raises this risk of social instability in poorer countries.
Let's talk about what can be done. It does seem extraordinary that, time and again, I'm hearing from central bankers, people in charge of monetary policy who say they are helpless at this point. This is sort of them facing the unknown. They are employed to understand where the levers can be turned in order to ensure that the rest of us can cope, on our daily lives. Do you feel that those in charge of policy around the world, and I'm thinking about central bankers specifically here, are equipped to do their jobs at present. And I have to say, I mean, you worked at the IMF for 4 years. Does the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, are these organisations fit for purpose at this point, given what we are facing?
Well, central bankers have tools which allow them to deal with financial crises, as we saw during COVID and in the great financial crisis at the end of the first decade of this millennium. They can support the economy, but their primary mandate in many cases is price stability. If that's consistent with supporting the economy, great. But right now, their problem is that there's actually a trade-off between getting inflation down and supporting economic activity. As the ECB raises rates, for example, that will have a contractionary effect in a situation where we already have uncertainty and high energy and food prices weighing on economic growth. But it's not that central banks are not fit for purpose. It's that you need a range of other